life. And we Japanese speakers tend to have problem with pronunciation, but the bigger problem we have is to do with the listening comprehension, hearing. And what we know is that there's something called accent, or the stress accent in English, which is a mystery to Japanese speakers. And what is it? And can you explain to us how it works?
So it's a mystery, I think, not just to Japanese speakers, but also to speakers of other European languages, such as French, which don't use stress accent in the same way. It's a little bit hard to define exactly what a stress accent is, because linguistically it can be several different things. It can be an increase in the volume of the word, it can be an increase in the tone or the pitch of the word, or it can be an increase in the length of the word, and often it's all three at once. But English is unusual in the regularity with which it uses stress. In every kind of group of syllables, then you will have at least one stress that falls. And you can understand this in several ways. One way is that it's connected with meaning and emphasis in a sentence. But another way is that it's connected to the fundamental rhythm of the language. So to English speakers, speech that is marked by regular stresses sounds more musical. It sounds more natural and more poetic too. The essence of English poetry for more than 500 years has been stress patterns.
So does it mean that if it's properly stressed, it's more understandable, and it makes you feel more at home in a way?
Certainly, if a sentence is stressed properly, then the speaker's meaning or the nuances of meaning are much easier to come across. You can take, there are many ways of taking a simple sentence like, I have to walk the dog tomorrow, and placing emphasis on just about every single word in the sentence in a different way to produce a different meaning. I have to walk the dog tomorrow. I have to walk the dog tomorrow. I have to walk the dog tomorrow. So certainly, if you don't listen attentively to these stresses, then you'll miss a lot of what the speaker wants to say. I don't know, can you do the same thing in Japanese, I wonder?
I think we can, about using your example. 私は犬をwell, we don't actually say 私は because, but maybe we can say 俺が連れて行くよ. And then we can say 俺が犬を連れて行く. Or maybe 俺が犬を散歩に連れて行く or 俺が犬を病院に連れて行く kind of differences can be expressed.
So you're injecting stress accent into Japanese.
Does it sound like stress accent?
Yes, it does very much. So it's
maybe this is a good way to practice stress accent then, to say one sentence in 3 or 4 different ways.
So maybe, I think when we're taught to learn Japanese, then we're told that it's a very kind of flat language tonally, and that we should try and, the textbooks will tell us this, that we should try and give equal emphasis to every syllable. But it seems that in Japanese, even if you don't have the second type of stress that I mentioned, the kind of melodic, natural, repeated rhythm, you do have the meaning stress, which occurs.
And actually, because you asked me to do it, now I realize that we tend to change the word order rather than putting stress on words. But in English, instead of changing word order or just removing some of the words, you put stress on different words.
Yes.
So that's a big difference, because I found it very unnatural when I tried to say one sentence in 3 different ways. This is interesting. So this, as I said, this is what we can do, to say Japanese in 3 or 4 different ways.
I think the important thing for Japanese speakers to remember is that their language, that it does have breaks and sort of places for emphasis. I think when non-Japanese speakers are first learning Japanese, we're told, like you said, that stress goes evenly on all the syllables. And that made me think, well, Japanese doesn't sound robotic. My first image was a robotic kind of even tone, but that's not the case at all. And it wasn't until I realized that the particles are the stopping points where you sort of assess the information that came right before and then order it so that you can understand the meaning. And it seems that in English, the stress points are the organizing principle for the meaning of the sentence, whatever's being said. So if you're a non-native English speaker listening to English, I would listen for the stress in order to find the key points. It's almost like bold text, even. If you don't have that kind of anchor, whether it's a Japanese particle or a stress accent, then of course you're going to be lost. You won't hear the kind of break in thought or the breaths that people take when they speak. So I think all languages must have some kind of...
So the idea is to catch the breath of the
Take
speaker.
Pause to kind of complete the unit of the sentence in order to put them all together.
Because Japanese speakers tend to take a long pause between units. Probably Japanese speakers are not used to catching these small pauses.
Yeah. I think people pause. They put more stress and emphasis on the particles than they do the words themselves.
Right.
So you say just anything, and then the particle is stress. So nani o, it's. For me, listening to Japanese, I look for those pauses, those stresses, to know where I need to reorder it in my head, because I don't have the usual syntax that a native Japanese speaker would have grown up with.
So one answer to my question, is that to try and catch the stress point where the stress falls. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because that's the point I'm stressing in my book.
Yeah.
But actually, the practice sounds reasonable. Well, it sounds reasonable that we practice this, but it can be very boring.
Yeah. Well, it's really unnatural to think about it. I didn't actually notice how uneven English pronunciation and intonation was until I studied a language that didn't have it. So when I started studying Japanese, and I was instinctively pronouncing Japanese words with a kind of lilting, sing-songy intonation, it sounds really strange. And so it made me look at my own language and think, oh yeah, that's why I'm doing it with a kind of da-da kind of beat when it's not supposed to be like that at all.
It's important to say, of course, that English isn't like Chinese. It's not a tonal language where if you get the tone wrong, then the meaning will be completely lost. But it's also true to say that your English won't sound fully natural unless you master stress patterns. I guess one quite good way to do this is obviously to expose yourself to as much natural spoken English as you can. But also, maybe this is predictable because I'm an English literature teacher, but I happen to think that literature and poetry in particular is quite a good way of practicing this. And in fact, I noticed that many of the examples that you used in your book were from poetry such as Shakespeare or Shelley.
I agree. That's a really sound approach, and it's one that native-speaking children learn in school, in their English literature classes, in their English language classes when they're learning grammar. They learn, they compare it with older kinds of sentences and newer kinds of sentences, and through reading older texts and more contemporary texts, they can see how it's used in different ways and how it has been used.
When students come into my classes in the first year, then they often think that poetry means rhyming. And it's true that a lot of English poetry does rhyme. But what I tell them first of all is that the heart of English poetry is, ever since, the Anglo-Saxon period, has been stressed and unstressed syllables. And the fundamental form of English poetry is iambic. Right? The iamb is a collection of two syllables, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress. And so the kind of heartbeat, if you like, of English poetry is da-dum, 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 da-dum. And once you have this very simple idea, you can go back and listen to virtually all classic poetry written in English, you know, Shakespeare, Milton, the Romantics, and you can hear this heartbeat, if you like, kind of sounding out. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Obviously, you don't have to accentuate it that much. But I think it's very important in order to appreciate poetry to be able to hear this sound in your head as you read.
Does that apply to ordinary conversation, do you think? When we speak in an informal situation?
I would definitely say yes. Your pronunciation is at the core of speaking any language, and if you want to know how to pronounce a word, you're probably not going to go too far off by looking for the kind of core of the word, the root. Maybe that's a little bit too advanced for a very beginning English language learner, but if you want to pronounce something, it's probably not going to be on the sort of letters at the end if the core meaning of the word is based on the collection of letters at the beginning. So when you hear someone speak a word, you can find the core of meaning by what is emphasized and what is not a THION ending, a shun ending, but what came before it is more important.
It's also the case that our ideas of what good English prose sounds like is very strongly connected to stress patterns. And so if you take, for example, things like political speeches, famous political speeches, and you try and analyze the stress patterns within them, you will find them very often falling into rhythmical patterns, often very close to the I am, because this simply is kind of ingrained in English speakers. That this is what good English sounds like.
To make a more mundane example, to give a more mundane example too, it's in advertising. It's in anything that's designed to communicate quickly and get attention and make people feel something and respond emotionally to something. I would say that it goes. Right from the lowest advertisements you see to the highest rhetoric you might hear from a politician or political, someone.
So here you hear heartbeat in good writings.
That's right, yeah. So even though English has vocabulary that takes in words from, all languages, really, the foundations or the heartbeat, as you say, is probably something that's survived from the early origins, at least.
So it suggests how important it is to be sensitive to sounds.
Very much so.
Okay, thank you very much.